you this morning, Roger. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being a part of this. And thank you for touching on a very current issue, racism. I'll turn it over to you then.
Great. It's really great to be with you all. I do have many, many fond memories of being here, not only the youth group, but again, this class, I think, the adult Sunday school class, which really launched me and helped develop my sense of calling. I always wanted to be an academic, and because you pursue a PhD and that's kind of what you want to do. And when it didn't happen, and when Francis got the job at the Lutheran Seminary in Gettysburg, I knew that I was going to back into the parish, and Christ Presbyterian Church really enabled not only a positive sense for what that was about, but gave me my sense of calling. And I really appreciate Charlie Idler and his affirming of whatever I did and that kind of thing. And I just couldn't say how much I appreciate what you all did for me, even though it was a short time. But the fun thing, I got to you because Charlie, I remember, took a sabbatical leave, and I preached all summer for you all. I remember I preached every sermon that I had. If I had gone any further, I would have run out of sermons. I would have had to say, no, I can't do anymore. That's it.
And started every sermon with a Charlie Brown joke.
I remember that. And I don't do that anymore. I've got to get back to that. Peanuts was the grist for the mill. I mean, you can't do better than Peanuts to get into theology, as far as I don't have Peanuts for you. I'm sorry. I'll think about that for next week. So I've got a topic here that this comes from an article that I just recently wrote that for the Journal Interpretation, which is the journal of the Union Presbyterian Seminary here in Richmond. And I really enjoyed writing this, and I've done a couple of Sunday school. No, actually, not just a couple. This will be the second time I've kind of given a presentation based on the article. But it stemmed from something I did for you all. You remember 2 years ago, right after the summer I retired, which is the theology of the cross, political theology of the cross. I'm going to define all these terms for you. But since then, of course, George Floyd happened, and the summer of reckoning, and now, of course, we have this very, very current experience with Ketanji Jackson and the hearing of her Supreme Court hearing, and the dealing with critical race theory. And so this stuff is very much in our consciousness. And so, I mean, in some sense, I thought when Mike wrote me and said, would you be willing to do this? I thought, well, maybe this is going to be a little out of date. Then I realized as we're into this is not out of date. It's right here. So let me just jump right in. I'm going to screen share, and may screen share a couple of times, a couple of things. I'll see how this goes. And I don't want to just march right through this. I want you to, I hope that you can, if you want to just break in, and somebody just start asking a question, because I want to be able to make this as interactive as I possibly can. I can see it's a tiny little screen there, but if you want to raise your hand real high, I'll stop and we'll talk. So I hope you can see this. Can you?
Says we can see it fine.
Great. So this is kind of a summary of the article, first half of the article. I'm going to do the second half next week. And so and I think you've gotten a blurb on this: dangerous memory towards an anti-racist political theology of the cross. And that is such a loaded title that I'm going to unpack it before I unpack it. Because dangerous memory has to do with, there's a lot of dangerous memories in American history and also in any history of any country, because there have been abuses of power in any country. And abuses of power in history. And in America, it does seem to me and to others that actually confronting these kinds of things is an exercise in patriotism. It's an exercise in how we are a great country, to the extent that we can face into the dangerous memory of our history of racism, which includes not just enslavement of Africans, but also the treatment and decimation of Native Americans in this country. This is not going to get into the latter; it's going to get into the former. But everything I'm saying here could apply. So dangerous memory kind of gets at theologically. This image has been used recently in a book by Eddie Glaude, and it's on. And I commend this book to you. I'll show it to you. I hope I have it here. There it is, right at the bottom there. Eddie Glaude, Begin Again, James Baldwin's America and Its Urgent Lessons for Our Day. Eddie Glaude is the professor of religion and African studies, Africana studies at Princeton University. And he's, by the way, a native of Mississippi. So he comes out of a history that that he's dealing with himself. It's really a very powerful book. There's a bunch of books that I'll refer to here, but and a lot of them are so some of them I wouldn't commend to your reading necessarily, but Eddie Glaude I would. And then the anti-racist political theology of the cross. Anti-racism, of course, is a term that has been around for a very long time. Anti-racism is confronting racism, and so the dangerous memory and anti-racism, putting that together, speaks to white fragility and our ability or inability to deal with racism, because it's such a fragile topic for us. And Robin DiAngelo speaks to that in her book by that title, White Fragility. And that is a book you probably have looked at it. It was a New York Times bestseller. We used it at Second Presbyterian Church here about 2 years ago with some success. I think she's been criticized in some ways, but I still think there's a lot to commend. But the whole notion behind dangerous memory is that when you confront stuff in your past, it brings up fragility. It brings up an automatic resistance and sometimes fear. We had at New York Avenue Presbyterian Church in DC. We right after the 2016 election, we had a sociologist, David Camp, African American sociologist, who came in to talk to us about training for white allies talking about racism with their friends and family. And the thesis he had was that election was so close that it would have been turned if white allies had been talking to their friends and to their friends and family about racism, because he felt that racism was so much a part of that election that the margins in the states that went for Trump versus Hillary Clinton were so thin that it could have been turned for that. Now I know I'm getting into political stuff here, and you can just push back at me all you want, because I'm ready for that. And having lived in Washington D.C. for 17 years, this is just what I was expected to do, and so I just jump in. And if you want to push back, please do. So political theology. What I'm doing here is when I talk about political, and I think I did this 2 years ago when I talked to you all. When I use that term, I'm not talking about Democrats and Republicans, because I think they can learn something from what I call political theology. And political theology goes back to the Greek word for polis, and that has to do with our common life. And so political theology came into existence as a way of doing theology in the 1970s. And it came out of Germany. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. Johann Baptist Metz, but also Jürgen Moltmann, who was a Reformed theologian, and he's part of our Presbyterian heritage, wrote the book, The Crucified God. And these folk, there were three Germans in particular that coined political theology. And they did it because in Germany, they felt that there was a desperate need to deal with what had happened in World War II and preceding that, and the Nazis and the Holocausts, and the privatization of religion, which means that it becomes a thing just between me and God, has no political ramifications, has nothing for a common life, and the whole idea that we should have something to say about our common life together. And so that's what political theology tries to do that. Then the theology of the cross just takes that into what is atonement theology, which has also been hopelessly domesticated to the point that it has no political ramifications or had none. And so this is the main area of my research and writing, is the political theology of the cross. And so this article that I'm using with you here, Francis and I are teaching a course at Union Seminary on the theology of the cross, starting here in about 4 weeks. And we're going to use this article, but we're going to use a whole bunch of other stuff, like James Cone's The Cross and the Lynching Tree, which I'll refer to here in a second. So that's political theology. When you take the theology of the cross and apply it to a contemporary circumstance, like the reality of lynching in the South, which didn't just happen in the South, it happened all over the country in Jim Crow. And so political theology tries to get at that. And the idea of a separation between church and state, by the way, has never been a reality. I mean, it's just been the core idea behind separation of church and state, of course, is that there is no state religion. Yes, I agree with that. But also what people don't acknowledge about that notion is that it preserves the independence of religion to speak in the public arena. And, evangelicals are doing that like crazy. And we Presbyterians have had a long historical heritage in doing that. And if you look in our own book of confessions, you've got the Barmen Declaration, which was a declaration of the confessing church in Germany in the 1930s, responding to the Nazis, and that was Karl Barth, and that's political theology. And so this is not a new thing. This has been happening. We just have given it a term now. So now that I've kind of unpacked a little bit the title, let me just jump in here. And here's a summary of where I'm going to go. The dangerous memory is twofold and simultaneous. It awakens and confronts the lie of racism, past and present, as it awakens the dangerous memory of Jesus crucified and risen. Let me just speak to that for a second. Really interesting that a theologian by the name of Ted Jennings says that the reality of the crucifixion as an historical reality dropped out after the first century. As Christianity moved into the mainstream, it tended to drop out. But in the crucifixion at its core was a state-sponsored terrorism. It was, if you know the realities of what happened during the Civil War in El Salvador, the death squads would have been a classic example of that. Or, as James Cone points out, lynching was another. For somebody who steps out of line with the contemporary mores or the restrictions that are put on them, then they get lynched or they get crucified in the Roman Empire. So the correspondences are all over the place. So in my mind, getting back to the piece before you, the positionality of the cross and resurrection disrupts our amnesia to the lie of racism and awakens the dangerous memory of our complicit in the reality of racism and its ongoing diminishments among a racially minoritized people. I'm gonna not read all of this. So I'm gonna keep going here. The gist of what I want to talk about, by the way, is this very last sentence in this first paragraph, which is the creation of relational agitational communities of resistance to racist ideas and policies. And by the way, by resistance, I don't mean violent, I mean nonviolent resistance, but pushing back. So one of the theologians that I am most indebted to, and her book we're reading, by the way, I don't give it to you here. I don't give you the reference. Sorry about that. It's Knowing Christ Crucified and that's a very readable book. We're using this in our course on the cross. She is an African-American theologian, and African-American theologian is called a womanist. And she is a prominent Catholic womanist theologian. And this is a fabulous book. And this is what she says. Christian theology must stand at the foot of the cross and not remain silent before the tears of a crucified world, the tears of crucified people. For Copeland, standing at the cross entails accountability for crucified people, past and present. In our American context, she turns a spotlight on the original crucifixion, the dangerous memory of chattel slavery. Again, that word that I've used to title this whole essay. The dangerous memory of chattel slavery and their living Black ancestors, both of whom disrupt our amnesia to the lie of racism. And so let me just now go to Eddie Glaude, because he has a quote here that I'm going to just read all of that I think so powerfully summarizes where we're at in this country right now. The lie of racism, and it must be exposed. And so the whole notion of the lie is how James Baldwin talked about systemic racism. And by the way, a lot of people want to make a point here, and what critical race theory is really trying to get at is systemic racism. And it started as a legal term to get a systemic racism in law. But now it's become, as people say, and I've got a definition of it for you if you want. Later, we can get at that. But it says it's not so much a theory as a verb. It kind of tries to look at systemic racism everywhere. So it's not looking at individual racist. It's looking at racism and how it kind of gets baked into us, and what Eddie Glaude is talking about. By the way, Eddie Glaude never talks about critical race theories. It's really interesting how this thing has been used as a weapon in our contemporary setting, and how it was used even just this week during the hearings for Judge Jackson. So disrupting the lie has to do with a frank and dangerous confrontation with the past, with one's memory. And this is the quote that I think is haunting. Baldwin's, and this is Eddie Glaude talking, Baldwin's moral vision requires a confrontation with history, with slavery, and with the ongoing consequences of the after times, shorn of the rosy tint of American innocence in order to overcome its hold on us. Ours, he says, is a cold civil war. We have those who are desperately holding on to a vision of the United States that has never made sense, at least to me, and those who are fighting for a birth of a new America. But even in the fight, the divisions of the country feel old and worn. Today feels like we're fighting old ghosts that have our country by the throat. I don't know how that quote strikes you, but today we are like fighting old ghosts that have us by the throat. Boy, that sounds like an accurate description of where we are. I mean, some of you, you've been looking at this as long, if not longer, as I have, and I've never experienced such a polarized time. I mean, trying to find something in the middle that we can talk about is probably one of the most difficult things to do these days. So again, if you want to break in, please do, because I don't want to just talk the whole time. Anybody, questions, anybody? I can stop sharing and go back. Yes, you got something?
Yeah, we have to have a mic so you can hear him.
Sure.
Critical race theory and those seem to become code words depending on which side of the fence you're standing. And it seems to me that we have to be very careful about using terms like that, which are flexible plastic terms, depending on what you're getting at. And sometimes I think that use of those terms is counterproductive rather than productive.
Could be. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. It could be. I mean, the way it's interesting that, the folk that have defined critical race theory are not the ones that brought it to attention. And it's mainly coming out of conservative voices. Let me just, if you want, I have if I can find it here, I have a definition. There we go. We just did, interestingly enough, here in Richmond, Robbie Perry, who is used to teach political science at Virginia Commonwealth University, and he just went to be the head of the political science department at Howard University. And he was a member of the Third Street AME Church here in Richmond, and he's a very good friend with the pastor. We just did a whole piece on demystifying critical race theory, and this is the facilitator's guide that he gave us that I'm showing you, and he's given a definition defining critical race theory. This is Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term critical race theory. Notes that it's not a noun but a verb. It cannot be confined to a static, narrow definition, but is considered to be an evolving, malleable practice. It critiques how social construction of race and institutionalized racism perpetuate a racial caste system that relegates people of color to the bottom tier. That's her definition. That's interesting. It seldom actually gets articulated. As she says, and as Robbie Perry says, to her knowledge, it came out of law schools, and it's not being taught in K through 12. But I mean, it's interesting to me how many people are talking about it, and it may or may not be a helpful concept. Frankly, I don't want to say I don't care, but as long as we're talking about systemic racism, I think that's the most important thing. By the way, I have a wonderful new study here in Richmond, but it's a converted porch and sun gets in, and that's what you're seeing here. I don't know if I can do anything about that. I'll see if I can come around here. There you go. That's a little better. So let me, if there aren't any more questions, let me just keep going and see if I can finish this presentation. And I'm going to, so there we go. So let me just talk about why the just before I keep going, just talk about why the cross, the political theology of the cross. Let me just summarize that. My own take on it, I think, can be summarized with 3 words: exposure, disruption, and empowerment. It's cross and resurrection. In Christian theology, whenever you see the word cross, you can separate it out only in the sense of there was an historical reality of terrorism that was used from the Babylonian era, which was 400 years before the time of Christ, up until the time of Constantine, who banned it. So we're talking about roughly 800 years that it was used. So it wasn't just a reality that was came into fore during the first century when Jesus died on a Roman cross. It was a form of terrorism that was used by many empires, not just the Roman Empire. And although it was mainly predominantly used in the West. But it was a form of state terror, and it was almost always done to the lower class, to slaves, and to insurrectionists. The interesting thing about the Roman Empire was, just like the American South, one of the greatest fears was the insurrection of those who were enslaved. And, that was very fearful thing in the Roman Empire, and it was a very fearful thing here. So in order to suppress it, it was like shock and awe to crucify. And when people were crucified, it was generally done in groups. And it was generally done along highways and not byways. It was highways. And it was meant to make a point. And that is this is what happens if you buck the system. And so that's the historical reality of the cross. What it became, though, was the interesting thing, and I did this with you, by the way, when I first came to you 2 years ago. I did the theology of the cross, and one of the exercises I always do, I did it with you, and it's just a very, to me, a very powerful exercise, is to read Mark's depiction of the crucifixion. And then I ask, what's the first thing you feel? What's the first thing you see in that? And the words are almost always dehumanization, humiliation, horror. And that is exactly what Mark is trying to communicate. The noted theorist Rene Girard says that what's striking to him when he read the Bible is that it's almost always told from the standpoint of the victims. It's almost always told, and that's what Mark is doing there. Because if you look in Roman culture and the way they would depict crucifixion is totally different than how the way Mark depicts it. The Romans would depict it as putting down the barbarian. They would depict it from the standpoint of a law and order society, that we are simply enforcing the laws of the day against the barbarians, and they would call them barbarians that would seek to overthrow it. And so that's the way they would depict it. It's conquerors. And I think I did this with you. I can't remember, but if you've ever seen the Dying Gaul, which is a famous statue in the Roman era, and it came to the United States, by the way. It's the most famous. There were many depictions of the Dying Gaul, but there was one famous statue that made its way from Italy to the United States, and it depicts a Roman. I'll see if I can find it here. I've got it in my. I've got it on my desktop somewhere, and I'll show it to you. But it's the ideology of empire. Basically, it's showing how what Roman law and order does. Because the Gaul or the Galatians, and by the way, this factors very much in Paul's letter to the Galatians. The Gauls were the historic enemies of Rome. They were considered barbaric people. And by the way, that's exactly that kind of dynamic that factored into the 14th century enslavement of Africans. And its religious justification is that Africans are barbaric people and in need of redemption and saving. And so that's the whole justification that the Pope gave in the 14th century for the enslavement of Africans. And it was, first of all, it was an economic reality, right? I mean, free labor is a nice deal. And so, so it's out of self-interest that it happens. And the reality, though, is you've got to justify it. There's a fact, by the way, if you don't mind, I'm chasing a bunch of rabbits here, and I'm sorry to do that, but I can't help myself. Willie James Jennings, the noted Yale theologian, wrote a book, Christian Imagination, in which he talks about the history of racism, and the first chapter is entitled Zorora's Tears. Zorora was a scribe for Prince Henry, one of the very first enslavers. And if you've ever been to Ghana and the Elmina Castle, slave castle, that was first held by the Portuguese. And they were the ones that were importing slaves and enslaving Africans. And by the way, that was a dynamic in Africa that is fraught with all kinds of ambiguity, because Africans were enslaving other Africans. And it was a horrible reality of intertribal warfare. But the Europeans definitely capitalized on it. And so Willie James Jennings depicts a scene in which Zarora recounts in his depicting of seeing the first Africans enslaved coming off Portuguese boats into a one of the most prominent Portuguese ports. And he sees these these enslaved people coming onto the auction block, and he sees their horrible state. He sees them crying. He sees mothers with babies. He sees this horrible scene, and he is brought to tears. And so Willie James Jennings entitles the chapter "Zarora's Tears." But the interesting thing about the chapter is that Zarora immediately, he's a religious person. Well, everybody was religious in Portugal in the 14th century. Again, the Pope justified this stuff. And so, but Zarora was brought to tears by seeing these enslaved people. And the first thing he does is he inscribes it. We have a depiction, a prayer that he offers at this point when he sees this, because he is brought to compassion for what he considers fellow human beings. But then he turns it. In the prayer, he turns it and says, "Show me, God, how this is within your providential design and plan for these people." It's a horrible thing to see. He's, on the one hand, there's compassion. On the other hand, he's been sold a theological argument for enslavement. And the Pope went along with it. And he starts to depict it. And it's because these people are in need of, quote unquote, redemption, that they are enslaved, because in their barbaric state, they would only live in chaos and violence towards one another. Of course, all of that is a lie. It's all a lie. But it was the stuff that was used to justify what they were doing. Sorry for that long aside, but that's relevant to what we're doing, because it's the very, very same thing that Eddie Glaude and James Baldwin see as the lie that is baked into American society. How do you justify it? You justify it because free labor his country was built on it. And two, it was built on enslaved labor, and you have to justify it. And there's always been a religious justification, but it gets baked into it. So I'm going down here to this paragraph. It says in bold, "Throughout our history in this country, the Christian faith has been used to justify, underwrite, and camouflage the structure of racism." Now down to the bold again at the very bottom. "The architecture of whiteness shields us from facing the cross." And I want to read this middle section, because I didn't actually get at the definition of the cross that I wanted to get at fully. In my mind, traditional atonement theologies tend to domesticate the cross. And so my political theology of the cross is actually in some ways, traditional atonement theology. They render it anemic for our purposes, for any political, social context. So when I said the cross exposes, it disrupts, and it empowers. The cross and resurrection I'm talking about. So the cross exposes abuses of power, large and small, started in the Gospel of Mark, which you see it in the Gospel of Mark. It disrupts it because it says, obviously, Jesus was innocent. Pilate said he was innocent. So it disrupts any kind of claim that this is an okay thing to do. But resurrection confirms that the life of Jesus is the way of God. And so you've got then empowerment for resistance to abuses of power, large and small. And so that, to me, is the summary of a political theology of the cross. And so I guess you could say I'm on a campaign, an obsession with the theology of the cross to try to get this stuff into a mainstream conversation about how how it can be a real resource for us to confront things like racism or any other abuses of power, large and small, in our society. So, so in this next paragraph, I say that our confessionals tend not to help because they come from such a commanding height. But Ignacio Ellacuría, one of the martyr Jesuits of the University of Central America in San Salvador, and he was martyred, by the way, by the death squads. So he was, in a sense, he was crucified. By the way, I'm sorry to do all these. I'm just chasing rabbits left and right, and I'm going to run out of time here. So I'm going to stop chasing rabbits. But Ignacio Ellacuría was martyred with 5 other Jesuit theologians because they were protesting against the Civil War. They were protesting against the abuses of the government in El Salvador, and they were martyred. And on one of them, as he was killed, knocked some of the books off of the bookshelf, and one of those books was a Spanish copy of Jürgen Moltmann's Crucified God. He's the one I referred to earlier that helped to define. He came out of the Nazi Germany. And he was a teenager at the time, and he had this horrific experience of getting conscripted into the German army at the tail end of World War II and becoming a prisoner of war. And then he read the Bible for the first time and became a theologian, protesting what was happening had happened in Germany, and helped to define political theology. So here's Ignacio, going back to Ignacio Ellacuría. He says he wants to open the eyes, and he's talking your eyes. He's talking to first world Christians, to those who are suffering so much. And then he says, this is the confession that maybe Ignacio Ellacuría would offer to us. What have I done to crucify them? What can I do to uncrucify them? What must I do for these people to rise again? And then one of Jürgen Moltmann's colleagues in Germany, who also had, along with Dorothy Solie, who came to this country after she became a theologian to teach at Union Seminary in New York, but Johann Baptist Metz and Moltmann both stayed in Germany to teach. But Johann Baptist Metz became a political theologian too. His experience was as horrific, if not more so, than Jürgen Moltmann's. He was conscripted as a 16-year-old into the German army at the tail end of World War II, and his 16-year-old battalion went to the front lines and was massacred by a Allied tank regiment that just came through there, but Johann Baptist Metz had been sent to the battalion headquarters, and he did not know that this had happened. And when he came back, he found all of his comrades, all of them dead, every single one of them. And it changed his life, as you can imagine. And he called it the silent cry. And he became a theologian, and he became defining what he called political theology as the dangerous Christ who breaks through our amnesia. And this comes from one of his most important books. And he says here, whoever bears the message of resurrection of Christ in such a way that the cry of the crucified becomes inaudible in it, hears not gospel, but myth. To follow Jesus, he says, is to risk danger and persecution. Yet for Metz, this is where salvation grows. A Christianity that is easy to bear, that is a symbolic exaltation of what's going on anyway, and of what determines the way of the world is weak. To be close to Christ, he says, is to be close to danger, says Metz. And this entails a political theology of conversion and repentance and solidarity with the poor. I am talking way too much. I'm not going to do that next paragraph. I'm just going to do this last paragraph. So when Jesus says taking up the cross, what I mean by that, how I interpret that is agitational. That it's always potentially dangerous process of naming and resisting the crosses that the disciples and others around us already bear, as well as anticipating a backlash because of it. Cross-bearing in our context is the daily tension of agitating, naming, and resisting racism, knowing that there will be backlash. The structures of white supremacy will fight back. And I'm just going to stop sharing because I'm running out of time and I've talked too much, and love to get some reaction. Pushback, reaction, what?
I've been handed the mic, but I don't have any reaction. I'm thinking of something trenchant to say, but I can't. So I'll pass the mic on.
Well, I think you've got us all thinking here. Maybe we're in shock, but certainly a timely subject, and we appreciate what you've done and what you've talked about.
How do I apply this to myself as an individual right here at Christ Presbyterian?
Great question. I mean, I think David Camp, I mentioned him. He came to New York Avenue Church. We asked him to come, and he did a training session for folk on how to talk about racism, especially with friends and family. And I think that's probably by the way, the second half of this, which I'll do for you next week, gets much more practical. It gets into community organizing. It gets into relational meetings and things like that. In community organizing, we talk about a relational meeting, which is not superficial chit chat, or just about, not superficial, about family, friends, things like that. It's actually getting at core issues. It's getting at the core things that either make us angry or are concerning to us. And I think that it is those kinds of conversations that we need to be having. And they're not easy to have. And I think we need to be trained to have them, to be sure, and how to talk about these very difficult topics. But I mean, being able to talk with family and friends and with your children and is the start. I mean, how to do that. I mean, I think the hard part about talking about racism is we always feel like we're going to make a mistake. And that's why I think talking with friends and with family is the easiest place to start, because at least you're assuming there that there's a loving relationship that will be lenient when we all make mistakes when we talk about racism. Who knows everything that there is to know about racism? I certainly don't. But being able to have those difficult conversations. I mean, one of the things he talked about, I remember he did it right before Thanksgiving, because he said, one of the illustrations he brought to us was, now, what kind of conversations are you going to have over Thanksgiving turkey? Of course, you might think, well, Thanksgiving, you don't want to talk about stuff like that, right? But yeah.
I'm going back to the CRT. In this area, it's believed that it's taught in elementary and high school. And you stated that it's not a high school subject. How do those, I know those rumors start, but I'll tell you, it's a big deal around here that our children are going to be felt guilty about what happened in the past, and why would you bring all this up? How do you combat that kind of thinking?
Well, if your children are like the ones that I know, they're having these conversations already. First of all, they're much further down the road than the adults who are talking about this stuff. That's profoundly my experience. It certainly was my experience in New York Avenue Church. The young adults we had an explosion of young adults at my church in DC, not because we were so wonderful, although I thought it was a wonderful church, but as I think Christ Church is. But because Washington, D.C., little known but true, is a very young town that is built on the almost slave labor of very highly educated young adults who go there for internships and this, that, and the other, and then get chewed up and in some cases spit out. It's a hard place to work, hard place to be. And they find their way to the church, and churches have a lot. We have a huge young adult group. I did young adult faith on tap for 17 years, and I would have 20, 30 people. They were very advanced in talking about this stuff because they'd had it in college, or they'd had conversation with their friends. It's a much more diverse reality for them anyway. But I'm not answering your question specifically. I think what people are saying is it's not in the curriculum because it's a law school topic. Critical race theory came out of the practice of law. Daniel, the person I just mentioned, Crenshaw, but also Daniel Bell, who were both Daniel Bell, who used to teach at Harvard Law and left there because he didn't think they were talking about the racial law through a racial lens. So it really is a law school curriculum topic. Why has it made it? It's because folk who want to stir up fears about talking about racism have used it as a weapon, and they've weaponized the notion without even knowing what it means. And basically, again, it as I understand the term, it's as Crenshaw says, it's more like a verb that really talks about talking about systemic racism in our world. Now, but if you don't mind a little, I know you weren't saying this, but I'm going to push back a little bit to those who say that they don't want their white children to feel bad about talking about racism, to feel guilty. Well, what about the African American? What about the black, brown, the Asian children who have been made to feel demeaned historically? And what about their feelings? We never talk about that. And so I heard an African American scholar actually say at one point, pushing back, that having this kind of discussion about critical race theory, the critical race theory as a theory is not being taught. It's too complex to be taught in high school and those kinds of things. I barely understand. I've got a PhD. The point I'm trying to make is it's not as a concept. It's not being taught. Is systemic racism being taught? That's another question. And I think people want to drum it out. But I mean, what about the feelings of African American children? I mean, to me, that needs to be part of the conversation too. Because I can almost, I'm a white guy talking here, so I mean, please take this with a grain of salt. But but you can bet that they're coming to this conversation from a very different perspective.
With that, I'm afraid our time is up, Roger. But we would appreciate it if you would consider closing us with prayer, and we'll look forward to seeing you and talking with you next week.
Very good. Yes, I'll do that. Oh God, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for the spirit of compassion and justice that comes to us at moments like this. And challenge us, oh God, to good conversations on topics that are so important for the church and for the society in which we live. And help us to be the kind of people that you would have us to be. In Christ's name, amen. Thank you, folks.
And thank you, Roger.